Hi, Bhuvana. Thank you so much for joining us on this learning and collaboration initiative that GAME is trying to do to really help micro enterprises and small businesses to not only survive but thrive in this especially when they come out in this post-COVID world.
Sure.
Just a little bit about GAME. GAME is, as you know, a platform for Michelin line partners to learn, collaborate, right, to really build a mass entrepreneurship ecosystem. And it's very important these right now because the MSMEs are the ones that are the most impacted. So what we're trying to do is that through these 60 days, 60 voices, we want to showcase and disseminate learnings, help in collaborations from various partners in the ecosystem, so that because ultimately I think everyone needs to move forward together to really help these small businesses to survive. So let me just introduce you and then we can take it forward from there. Hi, so today we have Bhuvana Anand. She is part of a think tank called CCS, which has a very, very noble mission where they imagine a world where each individual can lead a life of choice in personal, economic, and political spheres, and especially now where to provide a system where every institution is accountable. A little bit about Bhuvna. Bhuvna interests lie in regulation, governance, public finance management, and political economy. She has uh, worked on a number of welfare programs across India, including reforms on public distribution system and on implementation in direct benefit transfers. So welcome, Bhuvna.
Thank you, Marchita. Happy to be here.
Glad to have you. Bhuvna, as you know, MSMEs are the ones and mass entrepreneurs are the ones who are the most impacted by this COVID crisis. So, in your perspective, what are the real challenges for mass entrepreneurs?
Several, right? I mean, there are common challenges across entrepreneurs, but there are also sort of specific challenges for different classes of entrepreneurs, different sectors that they're involved in, etc. And I'm sure that nothing I say will be unfamiliar to our listeners, but I think that the sort of three top level challenges, of course, the biggest one is the cash flow story, right? When business is done, how do you keep paying your fixed costs? How do you keep paying payroll when nothing is moving? How do I do inventory management? You know, sort of those kinds of things around the cash flow story. Right? So I think that's challenge number one, obviously, is beyond the question of growing and becoming bigger, is surviving next week, the week after that, the week after that. That's one. The second is, the workforce problem. A lot of the small entrepreneurs rely on small workforces, so 3, 5, 10, 15 people. And a lot of them have gone back to their villages or to, hometowns. And one of the challenges is, how do you manage to keep the business alive when there is no workforce? And the third is raising credit, right? So in a lot of the world, or in a lot of the operation of financial markets, there should be some way of being able to raise credit to get you a little bit of respite as far as working capital goes, right? But this is really hard in India as it is, given how sort of financial lenders deal with small entrepreneurs. But of course, in this time, it gets even more exaggerated because there is no possibility or limited possibility at the moment of bridge loans that can get you over hard times. So these, I think, are the three big picture challenges around MSMEs, at least in the immediate term.
Okay. Now, I know the government has also issued a lot of schemes. So, how do you think these schemes can actually go down and trickle down to the mass entrepreneurs?
This is something that I've been breaking my head on, and it's not entirely clear to me, right? So one of the issues is the registered entrepreneur. So there is a way to be able to track registered entrepreneurs, but a large segment in among MSMEs is also unregistered or informal, or registered under different vehicles than the MSME vehicles. So how do you reach these schemes to all of them? It is not completely clear to me that this is going to be an easy exercise to do. I think among the schemes, there are two or three different sort of big buckets, right? One is, of course, the access to credit schemes that are coming up. It will take a while to mobilize all of these and to get them operational. And then it's still not clear to me how SMEs actually go and access these funds, right? So, for example, if lockdown persists, how do you go to a bank and register for a loan? If movement restrictions continue, what happens if you are registered in one place but physically in another and state borders remain closed? Sort of these kinds of operational concerns, I'm not completely clear how we will resolve them. On a separate side, though, there is a whole bunch of movement towards direct benefits transfers. I think some of this can really help, because if you think about it, if for small entrepreneurs, one of the biggest concerns for them is payroll, and sort of continuing to pay salaries of workforces, or figuring out how not to lay off employees, then direct benefits transfers can really help, because they provide some kind of income support to the workforce without while giving the entrepreneur some kind of breather to be able to manage his situation as well. So I think these are two or three sort of big picture scheme questions. That being said, I think it does need to be extended beyond just subsidies or handouts from the government, right? You also need to think about how will you ease some of the compliance burdens. So I know that there has been some movement towards loan repayment extensions, or towards tenure extensions, towards postponing the deadlines on some of these tax filings, for example. But there are other regulatory compliances which I'm not clear that states have thought about yet. Of course, it's hard to think about every one of these questions, but one thing that was on my mind is, for a small entrepreneur whose registrations are expiring or whose certificates are expiring, what do they do? For example, fire certificates or utility certificates, even enterprise registration certificates, sometimes they have a shorter lifespan. If they are between in the renewal date, what happens then? Right? So how do you tide over some of these regulatory and compliance issues? Then the paperwork keeps continuing. And in order to do paperwork, of course, on the one hand, you need people, but on the other hand, you also need access to systems, which at this time may be really, really hard for small entrepreneurs. This is also something for the government to think about.
So any particular solutions you mentioned about direct benefit transfers, any other solutions which you think could work, especially when, as you mentioned, about the registrations expiring and access to systems, and in this time, are there any solutions which you think could work?
So I don't know about solutions, but I think there are a couple of ideas that government should consider. The first is, I mean, again, this has been talked about before, is that what is the plan for ending the lockdown? Right? And not so much 100% clarity that on X date lockdown will end, but to think back to some of the challenges that we've encountered over the last 2.5, 3 weeks by suddenly moving into lockdown, right? So what is the sort of plan to correct for some of those previous mistakes? So is there a plan to be able to intimate and give advance notices? Is there a plan to, what is the way to start mobilization cross-state again? What is the way to, how are you going to provide for sort of bridge operations for small enterprises? So for example, our local kirana shops, right? Some of them are staying open just because they have some inventory, but the supply chain needs to start working. So what is the plan to get that going again? So I think these are questions that it would be helpful if the government put out some ideas on, or at least put out their approach on, so that even entrepreneurs sort of can rest back a little bit, take a breath and say, things will be fine, at least in the coming weeks or so. So I think that's one. The second is, like I said, there is a whole bunch of compliance and requirements that entrepreneurs have to face. If there is a way or a sort of simple whip to be issued all the way down the administration that, look, right now don't check for compliances, or if the compliances have lapsed in this particular period, is there a way to say that we will just simply extend it or deem extended until such a date that the systems are back up and running? So these are sort of two big things. The third is, there are ideas around suspending potentially some of the legal requirements. So for example, I know some of the labor laws, they don't apply to micro and tiny enterprises, but certainly they may apply to medium enterprises. So is there a way to be able to suspend some of them? One recent ruling that came up was the EPF requirements on that would cover a large section of enterprises. The Supreme Court had directed, in fact, governments to go ahead and implement this. What happens to that requirement? What happens to all of the dues that companies have to pay in this period, right? So government had made a good move saying that we will contribute, or we will contribute to a lot of the EPF contributions, both for employer and employee. But even sort of thinking through and issuing a clear guidance note for keeping in mind the smallest of enterprises and how this might affect them.
So, and I think government is important, but I think a collaborative effort is also really, really necessary. And that's what a game is all about, building a collaborative network. So what do you think game can do in this?
So one specific thing, and I think game is already considering this, but it might be useful to figure out who your nodal partners in different states are, and to have localized helplines available, right? Because state by state, there is so much variation in conditions, and presumably the return from lockdown will also vary state by state, right? Some states are in a deep crisis mode, or even certain geographies within states are in deep crisis mode. So it might help to identify nodal partners in each state and to put together a multi-interface helpline. So whether it's phone, whether it's an app, and for sort of listing out different types of challenges that may come across. I also suggest that over a period of time, if there is a way to collect all of the information from this helpline and to do a little bit of a quick dipstick analysis on it and share it with the government, right? Both the center and the state, so that they have a view into what kinds of issues folks are facing, and they might be able to issue quick guidelines to be able to fix some of those issues. So I think these are 2 or 3 things that game can do in its convening role.
Thank you so much for being part of this. I just want to summarize it a little bit. One of the things that really resonated was, having localized helplines state by state, so that relevant schemes can be communicated to the state governments. Another thing is obviously the pressing cash crisis. So some of the things that direct cash transfer, really extending beyond subsidies, understanding how compliances was work. And another thing that was really important was about the paperwork and access to systems, and really providing a system so that the registrations can be renewed.
Sure. Archita, may I add one quick thought?
Of course.
Just as I was speaking about it, one of the issues with the cash flow is the receivables, particularly receivables from government. Okay. So one, we think about handouts and direct benefits transfers. The other is just clear receivables.
Correct.
We have outstanding payments that are due to micro, small, medium enterprises, particularly under the Make in India scheme, particularly under some of the more recent schemes, and particularly PSUs who contract with smaller enterprises. Let's clear vendor payments. That can be sort of an immediate infusion of life into enterprises, right?
Yeah, I think these are really, really good inputs. Thank you so much, Bhuvana. Thank you for being part of this. And I'm sure it's going to help these small businesses.
My pleasure, Archita. Thank you for all the hard work you guys are doing.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.